Hello, in this video I'm going to be looking at the Ke-Ni Otsu. So this tank is or was available in a bonus code which Wargaming gave out on stream today, the 18th of December. To all the players who could get it, I believe it is limited. I'm doing this intro before the stream has happened, so I believe it is limited. I'm not sure. And I did do the entire video before I did this intro, so I might have said it's unlimited in the video. I'm not exactly sure, but now I believe it's limited. But basically, the Ke-Ni Otsu, very sought after tank for a very long time, and Wargaming is giving it out on stream for the reason that they want players to be able to experience the tank after so many years of it being this super rare, unobtainable vehicle, hence why they let me give it out in a giveaway. On that note, I believe they disclosed in the stream this tank is going to be rebalanced. If they don't, it's something they definitely should have disclosed, because that's a very important point to go over, and I was told by someone from Wargaming that we are allowed to say that the tank is being rebalanced. So, there's that. That is the reason they are giving it out, because players will be able to experience it for the last time in its state where it has almost 2000 DPM on its gun, with terrible stats in all other areas, which I will be getting into in this video. But yeah, basically, that is how you get the Ke-Ni Otsu today. And for those of you who have missed out on the code, on the giveaway, don't worry. What this shows very clearly is that Wargaming is changing their attitude on the tank. They want to make it available to players, and of course, with it being changed in the future, it will mean that it won't any longer be this tank with broken DPM but terrible stats in other areas, and they will be able to sell it. So yeah, there's that, if you do want it for collect purposes. Get right into the video then. Itself. It's a tier 3 Japanese light tank made infamous for its very high DPM, in fact tier 7, tier 6 levels of DPM in a tier 3 tank, and just due to that being an overall very broken tank back in the day, very OP tank back in the day, but not so much anymore, and I'll get into that in the stats in a minute. But basically what this tank is known for is it has a 4-shell autoloader with basically no reload time, only 3 seconds, which causes it to have 1920 DPM, roughly the level of a tier 6 medium tank. So basically back in the day it was just able to decimate everything it came up against, because it had such a fast reload, such high damage output, and such good DPM. But with 5.5 that changed. It's not the case anymore. This tank, at best it's mediocre, at worst it's bad. It still has the great DPM, but it just can't work. It cannot be able to use that DPM in battle, and I'll show you that with the stats. So there is a full tank review on my website. There's also a section in this tank review which compares it to the Ke-Ni, which you can find here on this page, but for now I'll just be talking about the Otsu. So firstly, this tank, known for being overpowered, but it's different to being broken. So this tank now is only broken, it's not overpowered, and that is because of its poor stats in all other areas. Where other tanks got buffed in 5.5, this didn't. And one of the main issues you'll see with the Otsu is its terrible armor. So this is against 40mm AP. On all aspects, that is very low penetration, even compared to tier 2, 40mm is nothing impressive, and you'll see no armor at all. The only red areas are around the gun, but it's not like you're going to bounce. You can hit the whole hull. Next, let's look at 41mm of HE, and you can see no change. It's very HE penetrable, and that is something very bad, because tier 4 tanks do have the access to HE, unlike tier 3 and tier 2, which don't. And you can see here the armor 16 to 18 on the front, on the lower plate is 20, and the turret at best is 30. So you really do not bounce anything in the Otsu. So very weak armor there. Next, the gun. This tank mounts a 37mm gun. Its damage is 40 on AP, 36 on Premium, and 50 on HE. All okay damage considering this tank has 4 shells in the magazine, which allows it to do a burst of 160 in 2.01 seconds, which is how long it takes to unload the damage. Total magazine reload, only 3 seconds, giving it 1920 DPM. Extremely high DPM. The only tank that even comes, well, close-ish is the Valentine AT, which is the next highest DPM in Tier 3. Penetration, 48 on Standard, terrible. Premium, 69, that's alright, it's still not great, it's okay though. And HE is 18, which, for all considered, for a 37mm gun, HE is not bad penetration, that is okay. But at this tier, what are you going to be using it against, really? Not much. Aim time is 3.8 or 3.6 seconds, depending on your equipment. Base aim time is 1.6, which doesn't sound bad, but for this tier, it's quite bad. And you can lower it down to 1.3 with equipment, and the dispersion is 0.375 or 0.326. That is pretty average. It's nothing special, but it's not bad at all. Gun handling is 0.18, 0.18.1. That is okay for this tier. A lot of tanks have terrible gun handling, even light tanks and medium tanks, so this gun handling is nothing bad at all. Gun depression is 15 degrees over the front and sides. It says 11 on the sides here, but I just checked that yesterday. That is not correct. It's 15 over the front and sides and 11 over the rear. And shell velocity is 580, which is terrible. So this gun, I say it's okay here, but that's in the best of scenarios. At best, it's okay. At worst, it's abysmal. And the reason for that is its penetration is terrible. Its damage is very low. Its aim time is poor for its tier, and its shell velocity is very bad. This makes it very hard to deal damage in any situation other than where you are at point blank range and you're just able to spam damage into the enemies. And the reason for that is slow shell velocity makes it hard to hit over long range, terrible penetration makes it very hard to penetrate even some tier 3 tanks, let alone tier 4 mediums, which a lot of them have pretty good armor for having such low penetration. Its damage, single shot, is 40, and you might say, oh well, it only takes 0.67 seconds to do 80 damage. Yes, but other tanks in this tier don't have a delay on their 80 damage. They can do it in one shot. You're taking 2 to do 80 damage. And then of course it takes 2 seconds of your tank being exposed to deal the full 160 damage. You might think, oh, but it's a lot of damage. It's not when you can push out, do one shot, the enemy does one shot into you, and then the enemy pulls back into cover. How are you going to deal your 160 damage unless you push them? And one note, you cannot push them because your HP is lower than all tier 2s except tank destroyers. So what are you going to do to get your damage out? It's really bad at dealing damage unless you're in a scenario where enemies aren't looking at you, they aren't shooting at you, they're completely ignoring you, and the enemy has no armor. So overall, this gun, at best, it's okay. At worst, it's bad. It's not a good gun. And that's despite its amazing DPM. It just can't use this DPM at all. And that's just due to having 4 shells, having low penetration, terrible shell velocity, bad aim time, and taking a whole 2 seconds to unload damage, whereas other tanks take 0. But yeah, the gun. Top speed, the next, mobility, top speed 50, that's pretty average for tier 3. 20 in reverse, again, pretty average. Traverse speed is great, 60 degrees, and 42 on medium. 42 on medium is quite bad for this tier even, especially a light tank. The acceleration rate is 19 horsepower per ton. The tank only weighs 7 tons. And then the actual acceleration is actually very good on hard terrain, 27 horsepower per ton, and 19 on medium. On medium, it's okay. It's a very big decrease, but it doesn't feel actually too bad. What feels bad on this tank's mobility is the medium terrain traverse speed, which is very mediocre. 42 is... At this tier, there aren't that many heavies, but a lot of the heavies do actually have such fast traverse. So, it's okay mobility, but this traverse really does make the tank feel quite sluggish on medium terrain, especially when it has to turn. So, stats out of the way, I'll quickly get into the equipment and then I'll compare it and talk about why this tank is very misjudged. But yeah, equipment calibrated shells is mandatory. As said before, your penetration is absolute crap. You very much need calibrated shells on this tank to have any chance of going through any vehicles, really. And a lot of the tanks in tier 4 you'll face, you always need to use premium ammo for. Next, improved control. Just because this tank's traverse speed on medium terrain is quite bad, 42 is very unimpressive, not great at all. And the acceleration, as said before, it's fine, all things considered. Next, improved assembly. For the extra hit points, I mentioned very briefly, this tank has the hit points of a tier 2, and that is true. You definitely need improved assembly, because if you don't, it seems like 16 hit points isn't a lot, but it does actually help, especially as this tank has no armor at all. You do need improved assembly, just because other tanks in your tier and even the tier below just outmatch you in hit points. Next, supercharger. Despite this tank having bad aim time for its tier, the shell velocity is much more noticeable and much more important, especially as this tank also has low penetration, and due to being very fragile and weak, sometimes you might have to engage enemies from a long distance, and thus having supercharger with its improved penetration loss over distance and of course shell velocity, it is really helpful. Even in closer ranges, supercharger is useful. Just because 580 meters per second is very bad shell velocity, even for this tier. And next, vertical stabilizer. Just because this tank, again, its handling is okay, but it's nothing amazing. Its aim time is bad, and it's a 4-shell autoloader, meaning it has that full aftershot bloom, and improving it with vertical stabilizer does help. You might be thinking, oh, but refined gun improves dispersion so much. Generally, you are not fighting tanks at long distance. You do not need refined gun. You might say, oh, but it improves your accuracy at close range as well. It doesn't when your aim time is this bad. You'll just be derping shots left, right, and center, and that's just because your aim time will be so slow. 3.7 seconds is very, very poor for tier 3. And I'll show that in a minute. So, toolbox and consumable delivery system, again, just normal. Ammo. This is actually very important, and I actually have it set up wrong here. I would recommend 56 premium AP and 50 AP, just due to this tank shooting extremely fast, missing a lot of shots, and needing a lot of premium ammo. That premium ammo is very much an important factor of the gameplay of this tank, because you just can't penetrate a lot of tanks with standard. And of course, consumables, just normal. So, that is the equipment. Let's talk about why this tank is extraordinarily misjudged and overrated. So, I have a section, if I can find it, comparing the two tanks. So, playing the Otsu, you'll notice a few things. One, it turns very slowly. It doesn't feel like a very fast mobile light tank, which quite a few tanks that you compete with in tier 3 are. Despite this, it does have some very nice flexibility because the tank is tiny. It has amazing frontal and side gun depression, just like the regular Ke-Ni. But then, other than this, that's where the good ends, other than its gun depression and its high DPM. The gun feels very hard to use, very awkward, because you have to shoot a lot to get out your damage. That means you have to be exposed for a long time against the enemies to be able to deal that damage, and because your hit points are so terrible, you take shots in return, and that lowers your lifetime in the battle. your high DPM isn't working well because enemies are playing a trading game. Meanwhile, you're playing a DPM game, which doesn't work in tier 3. Everyone has higher damage than you, everyone deals that damage in a single shot or 2-shot bursts, and you get out damaged so quickly. This tank basically, essentially, it doesn't do damage fast enough. The Ke-Ni does 130 damage in 0.67 seconds. You do 160 in 2 seconds. So it's a very big difference. Yes, the Ke-Ni does 30 less damage, but it's exposing itself for much less time. And then one other thing, 400 HP is the lowest in tier 3 of any tank, even tank destroyers. It's the lowest in tier 2 of any tank except tank destroyers. This means that in general, where tanks at this tier take away roughly 12% of your HP, it is very bad. It means you can only take a few shots before you're sort of down to a 1-shot. And of course, you face tier 4s, which can have high alpha damage, up to 140, or for example, the most scary tank you can face, a Covenanter with 220, would take away more than half of your hit points in a single burst. It makes this tank very hard to play. Its DPM, its very high damage output, just isn't what it used to be because the meta has changed in tier 3. So let's look at this. Here's the Ke-Ni Otsu compared to tier 3 in terms of its DPM. We can see 1920 is far above the next highest, which is the Valentine 80, and then even a lot higher than the Ke-Ni, which is the next highest after the Valentine. But it is worth noting how high DPM the Ke-Ni is. And then you can see, even compare it to tier 4, it still far outclasses everything it faces. You'd have to go up to tier 6 for the Ke-Ni to finally be brought down a few to be next to, well, the highest DPM of tier 6. But that's where it ends in terms of the good for the Ke-Ni Otsu. Let's look at the aim time. So here, the fastest aim time in tier, well, let's go 2, 3, and 4. We can see that the Ke-Ni is right down here, right down at the bottom, with the very high alpha damage tanks that it faces. For example, the Hetzer with 160 alpha, the T40 with 165, the B1, that's not high alpha, but it's a tier 4, where tanks start getting worse aim time to balance out against tier 5s. And that's one thing to note, in 5.5, or the updates after, aim time was buffed massively for all low tier tanks, so they aim extremely fast, and that didn't happen for the Ke-Ni. You can see that here with the comparison. It's sitting right down at the bottom with tanks that have 180 alpha damage. This tank does 40, so not good at all. Next, standard penetration. Ke-Ni Otsu right at the bottom with the lowest penetration tanks in tier 3. Let's see premium penetration right at the bottom again. The only tank with worse premium penetration is the BT7 artillery, because that uses that doesn't have a premium round actually. So yeah, the worst premium penetration in tier 3. Next, let's look HP, hit points. Against tier 3 and 2, this tank has the lowest hit points. Actually, no, this isn't hit points, this is damage. Single shot damage, this is the lowest of all tier 2 and 3 tanks except the autoloaders, the Panzer IIJ, T2 Light, T7K, and Light Mark 6C. The Ke-Ni, only doing 40 damage, is even outclassed by the Panzer IIG, which also is a 4-shell autoloader and will outdamage you very easily just because of a faster burst. And you can see that this is what makes the tank very hard to do damage with. Everything you face outtrades you, and you have the hit points of a tier 2, meaning even tier 2 tanks will outtrade you in damage. You have to use the DPM, and it's very hard with such low hit points. So next, shell velocity. Let's look. Oh wow, again at the very bottom of the list is the Ke-Ni Otsu, right along with the derp tanks, Grosstraktor, Panzer IV-A, UC 2-pounder, the mediums, and of course BT7 artillery and T82. Very low shell velocity. And then hit points right at the bottom again. only above the Cruiser 1, actually the same as the Cruiser 1, and above the Tier 2 tank destroyers, which again, if you didn't know, tank destroyers have the lowest hit points of any tanks in any tier. So it's getting out-traded, out-damaged, and being out-competed on hit points by even Tier 2 tanks. So just very bad news for the Ke-Ni Otsu in every area of its stats other than DPM, and we can see that here. Let's compare it to the Ke-Ni, which is a tank everyone could have gotten for free a while ago in a bundle in the store, I believe last year or the year before. And the Ke-Ni is arguably the best tier 3 light tank in the game, because it has all the traits that the Otsu wants to have except DPM. However, it kind of does its damage in a more effective way, thus giving it higher effective DPM. So let's see, raw DPM is much lower. The reload time on the Otsu is obviously double, it's much better. Intra-clip is the same on both tanks, which is important. The Ke-Ni does 2 shells in its autoloader, the Otsu does 4. But look at this, penetration on the Ke-Ni much higher, 10mm more on standard ammo, and if we go to premium, it's 5mm more, which it does make a massive difference for what you can go through at this tier. Next, alpha damage. So this is where the shell number is important. The Ke-Ni does 2 shots of 65 damage, the Otsu does 4 shots of 40 damage. So if you compare these tanks, let's say you can only put out 1 shot before the enemy retreats. The Ke-Ni has done 65, which is a whole 25 more damage than the Otsu does, which is a lot in this tier. And if you have to reload, your reload time is still only 6 seconds, which, let's be fair, it's not all that long. 3 seconds is fast, but a lot of the time you'll be sitting there with extra time to spare. You could have reloaded for 6 in the Ke-Ni and then had much more effective alpha damage to be able to deal with enemies. Also a much faster burst time, 0.67 compared to 2.01, because the Otsu has more shells. Caliber is the same. The shell velocity, again, the Ke-Ni is winning. An extra 200 meters per second is massive. Its aim time is also significantly better, so much better on the Ke-Ni, and that completely balances out this worse gun handling, and the Ke-Ni just feels way more accurate. Gun depression is 14 over the rear, but on the front and sides they're both the same, which is 15. And then mobility. So obviously it will look like the Otsu is better, and that will be down to its great hard terrain resistance, but on medium terrain you'll see that the Ke-Ni is actually quite a bit better by 1 horsepower, and of course on traverse speed by 4 degrees, which again, one of the big issues with the Otsu is that its medium terrain mobility isn't all that impressive. And then of course 90 extra hit points, which at tier 3, 90 extra hit points is massive. It is a crazy amount of HP, because that is worth multiple shots of damage. But you can see here, basically, other than raw DPM, the Ke-Ni is just better in every way. And while the Ke-Ni is one of the best tanks in tier 3, it does sort of show you what the Otsu has to deal with. All other tanks in tier 3 having much better aim time, much better alpha damage, much better penetration, much better sort of mobility for many of the light tanks, and much better shell velocity. So the Otsu just has a very hard time dealing with the enemies that it has to face. While I have 2 good battles in the Otsu to show you, I do want to point out these are not regular battles in the tank. I have to play quite a lot to be able to have these 2 relatively decent battles. And getting 2000 damage in battle in this tank would honestly be a miracle in the current meta. You'll see over there the error in my ammo loadout. Again, having 16 HE, you won't use the HE much at all. In this game, I could have, but notice some things about this tank. You'll see how slow I am. This hill, you'll see the traverse speed is. You see I'm trying to get into this bush to use this tank's small size and great capability. Notice a few things about this battle, how little damage I do per shot, how many shots I bounce, how many shots I miss because of the wait time or the shot velocity. You can see that here. I get 1 shot out of 3 because in this game I'm not using a shell. 1 shot out of 3 again, or 2 shots out of 3. Because the M7 has really troll armor. In the full TP, you can see that the shell velocity, even though I'm hitting it, you can still see it's quite slow. As a 4D, you wouldn't think it's armored, but so here we're being flanked by a Panzer III-A. I'm a bit careful with my aiming because I do not want to miss, but there you can see I take 69 damage in return, whereas I only do 14 shots. Luckily, I hit that tank with multiple shots, but if he'd been moving, I would have been screwed. So here you can see I made a bit of a mistake. I forgot to switch back to standard ammo, and I'm using my premium ammo. You'll see a bit of a shoot. This tank, because of how fast it shoots, it runs out of ammo very fast. Again, 5 doing 8. I'm going to realise I'm using the wrong ammo. These front sorry. This tank's low penetration does mean that even against many medium tanks you face, for example, a Panzer III or a Panzer IV, you do have to use premium ammo. And there's a problem with this tank again. You do face those big tier 4s like the Panzer IV-D. You can see he took away a ton of my hit points with that single shot. Now here's the opportunity to take since they're like circles now facing the M7, notice I'm down to a 1 shot. In any other tier 3 tank, I would not be a 1 shot. I'd be able to rush that M7 and take a shot and damage. But with the Otsu, with its very low hit points, I'm not able to do that. You can see it's undeniable how fast this tank is able to deal damage if it does have the opportunity to farm up and just be ignored by its enemies. Now, when you guys get this tank, it's going to be a bit of a different scenario. I believe a ton of people are going to be playing the Ke-Ni Otsu, and there'll be a ton of them in the matchmaker, which means you're on even ground. You can deal your high amounts of damage against an enemy Ke-Ni just as they can against you, and you've both got low hit points. So I'd say spam this tank as much as you can before people stop playing the Ke-Ni, because then it's going to get power crept out of the meta just as it has over the last few years since 5.5. But you can see there, doing 1000 damage, which for a tier 3, that is very good. That's 3 times the hit points that I have on this tank. So, next, you would have seen this replay already if you watched the giveaway video. And in this battle, not changed my ammo yet again. In fact, this one happened before the battle. So I have the default press account ammo layout, which is dividing the shells evenly into 3 types, which is unfortunate because it means I have very low ammo to use. So there you can see I get a bit lucky hitting that second shot on the Luke's, just because the shot blew out after your first one and you do have to shoot 4 shells. But you can sort of see how I'm playing this tank. It's being very cautious, very careful. I have hit points of a tier 2 and I'm facing tanks at tier 4. That Luke's does 180 damage burst. Yes, I do 160, but for him it takes less than a second. I take 2 seconds. So it's going to be very hard to play against an enemy like that. But here you can see I'm being a bit careful with when I take out, not to take damage. But luckily I am able to put the magazine to those 2 enemies. You can see sort of what makes this tank quite funny. You shoot you're going on magazine reload, and then your reload is done and you can shoot again. That's what made this tank broken. 3 second reload is absolutely insane. Unfortunately though, this tank just not as good as it used to be. It's definitely not the overpowered beast it once was. It's still broken, but it's not overpowered. Here you can see I'm getting a bit of a I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing because this tank has bad accuracy, it's got bad aim time. And it's got a large balloon on. So doing what I did there, moving back and forth against the Panzer 38 meant that my shots were becoming less accurate. I picked 2 of them, and of course the Chevrolet C. So again, facing these tier 4s, a bit painful. The Armour SA-40 does 190 damage to me, which is almost half of my hit points in a single shot. And you can see that now, after that shot, I'm not able to trade, I'm not able to go take hits against that Gross Tractor, the Su-76, just because that Armour has hit me for half my hit points in a single shot. Again, you can see bad show velocity, poor dispersion, meaning I only hit 1 shot out of 4 against that SU. And now you can see I'm down to 3 AP, so switch to reload ammo to reload easy, just to have that 3 AP and better penetration. So unfortunately here, it's down to a 2v3. The A-20 is holding up well to try to take out that Gross Tractor, and then deal with this Su-76 while he's not turned yet. And for those of you who don't play tier 3, note some scary tanks in this battle. The Su-76, the FCM-36 PAC-40. Like the Object 268 in tier 10 at this tier, because they do 180 alpha, which is rather insane, where everything else got alpha damage nerfs from 5.5, and then these tanks got buffed back to 180, which is very scary for a tank like this. Hit points. But you can see here I'm being a bit careful as they get some more, letting the A-20 put in his damage, which is important because this guy has no being out, it's easier for us to deal with him. Luckily, that game, we were able to win, quite luckily actually, because of this tank having very low hit points and penetration. You could see how it struggles to go through that some more, but getting an ace tanker, 1,177 damage. 60,000 credits is alright. You can see that these low tier tanks hardly lose any credits, just because in low tiers you have very low repair costs and such. But yeah, Ke-Ni Otsu. For those of you who can get it right now, as this tank is being released to everyone, to the public, spam the tank while you can, before people stop spamming it, because this is the only time in probably 5 or 6 years that the Otsu will feel like it is an overpowered tank, just because there'll be a lot of them in the matchmaker. You can actually deal with the armor of an enemy Otsu. The enemy Otsu also has low hit points. It's the only time when a pre 5.5 tank will actually be quite abundant in the meta, since everything else has been sort of buffed, changed since 5.5. So yeah, play it while you have the opportunity to, before this tank gets changed, before people stop playing it, because this tank will be rebalanced at some point in the future. It's not going to stay this way, and that's for the better, honestly. This tank is just not good in the current meta. It's not got hit points, it's not got armor, it's not got anything going for it other than DPM, which it can't use. And evidence of that is Ke-Ni. It's a better tank. But for those of you who don't want to play the Ke-Ni Otsu, go grab yourself a Matilda, or something else that's pretty armoured in tier 3 to 4, and go spam that while the Otsus are out in abundance, because you will completely destroy them by having armor and also usable HE shells. But yeah, it's nice that Wargaming is giving this tank away. It's needed, really. for having this tank being so exclusive, so unobtainable for such a long time. It's nice that they're giving everyone a chance to experience it before they do a rebalance on it and make it sort of better for the matchmaking and more usable in battles. But yeah, go play the Otsu while it is available through the bonus code, and enjoy it. Thanks for watching.